A man on trial. A judge who knows him. A truth no one saw coming. This case is about to shake the courtroom to its core. The courtroom was packed. The air thick not just with the weight of justice, but with the silent tension that came with every new case. Judge Elijah Brooks adjusted his robe, straightened a few papers, and looked up as the next defendant was brought in. Just another day, another case. But then everything stopped. Elijah felt his breath catch. The man standing before him, wrists shackled, his jumpsuit hanging loosely over his once strong frame, wasn't just another defendant. It was him, Tarren Lawson, the boy who used to live 3 houses down. The one Elijah raced to the corner store with after school. The friend who had his back in every fight, every struggle, every moment that shaped their childhood. And now, Tarren stood in front of him, his head slightly lowered not in shame, but in exhaustion. Then, his eyes lifted, locking onto Elijah's. And in that instant, Elijah saw everything years of hardship, a life that had taken a different path. But worst of all, he saw a silent question in Tarren's eyes. "Do you still see me?" Elijah tightened his grip on the gavel. His mind spun. He was supposed to be neutral, unbiased. The law didn't care about childhood friendships. But how was he supposed to sit here, cloaked in authority, and judge a man he once called his brother? The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the state presents Tarren Lawson, charged with armed robbery and aggravated assault." The words crashed over Elijah like waves, each one heavier than the last. Armed robbery. Assault. This wasn't the Tarren he remembered, the boy, who had dreams of escaping, who once swore he'd never fall into the same traps that had claimed so many from their neighborhood. He forced himself to breathe. The courtroom was still watching. He couldn't afford to waver. "Mr. Lawson, do you have legal representation?" Terrence's voice was rough like it. Hadn't been used in days public defender. "Your Honor." Elijah barely nodded. "Proceed." But as the prosecutor started, laying out the case, the judge wasn't listening anymore. His mind was trapped. In the past, back when they were just 2, kids on the same block trying to survive, a world that had never made it easy for either of them, and now one sat on the bench, the other stood in Cup S. But this was only the beginning. Elijah barely heard the legal jargon being thrown around in the courtroom. His body was there, seated high on the bench, but his mind, it had traveled back decades to a time before the robe, before the gavel, before life had split them down. 2 separate roads. He remembered the sticky summers in Birmingham, Alabama, long days spent dribbling a beat-up basketball on the cracked pavement, the chain-link fence rattling with every missed shot. He and Tarren had been inseparable, 2 kids from the same block dreaming of something bigger than the corner store and the rundown apartment complexes that boxed them in. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Tarren had asked one night, both of them lying flat on the hood of his uncle's busted-up Chevy, staring at the sky every damn day. Elijah had answered they made a pact that night. They'd make it out together, but life had other plans. Elijah had his mother strict but supportive, a woman who made sure he stayed in line, who pushed him to hit the books harder than he hit the basketball court. Tarren, his father, had walked out before. He even had memories of him. His mom did her best. But addiction had a way of taking over, leaving Tarren to fend for himself most nights. By the time they hit high school, the split was already happening. Elijah buried himself in school, desperate to keep his grades high, enough for a scholarship. Tarren, he was skipping class, running with older guys who had fast money and even faster tempers. "You don't get it," Tarren had said during one of their last real conversations. "You got options, Eli. Me, this is all I got." Elijah had tried to pull him back, but the streets had their claws in deep. And now, decades later, here they were, Elijah back in Birmingham, but sitting on the other side of the system. Tarren standing in cuffs, his future hanging in the balance. A voice pulled him back to the "Present your honor." Elijah blinked, realizing the prosecutor had been speaking. "My apologies," he said, clearing his throat. continue. But as the charges were read out, one thought lingered in his mind. Had he really made it out, or had he just been lucky enough to slip through the cracks while his best friend fell through? And this case was about to bring all those buried questions to the surface. The words hit like bricks. The defendant, Tarren Lawson, is charged with armed robbery and aggravated assault. The state intends to prove that on the night of September 14th, Mr. Lawson entered a liquor store on Fifth Avenue with a firearm, demanded money from the cashier, and in the process shot and wounded an innocent bystander. Elijah kept his face unreadable, his training kicking in, but inside his stomach was twisting itself into knots. Terrence Gunn, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Denton, wasted no time laying out the details. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. We have security footage placing the defendant at the scene, a partial fingerprint on the counter, and a witness who has positively identified Mr. Lawson as the perpetrator. The victim, Mr. Alvin Pearson, suffered a gunshot wound to the leg and is prepared to testify to the trauma he endured that night. Elijah felt the weight of every eye in the room, the jury, the attorneys, the spectators, some just there for the drama, others genuinely seeking justice. But only one set of eyes mattered right now. Tarren Elijah finally looked at him for the first time since walking into the courtroom. Tarren lifted his head and met his gaze. His eyes, those same deep brown eyes Elijah had known since childhood, held no anger, no fear, just something heavier. Resignation. Mr. Lawson, the judge said, forcing his voice to remain steady. How do you plead? A pause, then low, but clear. Not guilty. Your Honor. A murmur ran through the courtroom, hushed whispers passing between reporters and spectators. Elijah turned to the defense attorney, a weary-looking public defender who had probably juggled too many cases and too little time. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence, the lawyer said. The prosecution may have footage, but it's grainy at best. There are no clear fingerprints on the weapon, and the so-called witness only saw the suspect for a few seconds in a moment of chaos. We argue that Mr. Lawson was in the wrong place at the wrong time and has been unfairly targeted due to prior offenses. Offenses. The words echoed in Elijah's head like a hammer striking steel. This wasn't Terrence's first run-in with the law. He'd been arrested before petty theft, a few fights, even a drug possession charge in his early 20s. Nothing had stuck long enough to keep him behind bars for too long, but now the system was ready to bury him. Elijah inhaled slowly. It wasn't his job to save Tarren. It was his job to make sure justice was served. Very well, Elijah said, keeping his voice neutral. This court will proceed with the trial. The jury was selected. The arguments began, and with every new piece of evidence, Elijah realized one thing. This case wasn't as simple as it seemed. The trial moved quickly, but with each witness, each exhibit of evidence, Elijah felt something gnawing at him. Something was off. The security footage played on the screen for the jury. A hooded figure entered the liquor store, waved a gun, and within seconds, chaos. The cashier ducked a shot, fired. A man stumbled, clutching his leg. The suspect grabbed a handful of cash and bolted the video. Paused, Your Honor, as you can see, Prosecutor Denton said, addressing the jury. The suspect's spilled clothing and movement matched the defendant. But if that's not enough, let's talk about the witness. Elijah already knew what was coming. The prosecution called Jason Coldwell to the stand. Elijah's grip tightened on his gavel. Jason Coldwell. That name was familiar. Too familiar. A former neighborhood friend? No, not a friend. Problem back in the day. Caldwell had been that one kid always looking for a fight, the one who stole from his own people, who never cared about loyalty or brotherhood. If Tarren had ever had an enemy, it was him. Caldwell took the stand, straightened his cheap suit, and leaned into the microphone. Yeah, he said, glancing at Tarren. That's him. I saw him that night. Tarren didn't react, didn't flinch. He just kept his head down. And how can you be so sure? Denton pressed Caldwell, smirked. I grew up with him. I know how he walks, how he talks. That was him in that store. No doubt Elijah studied Tarren. No outburst, no protest, but there was something in his eyes, something Elijah recognized. Betrayal. The defense attorney stood. Mr. Caldwell, isn't it true that you have a criminal record? Yourself. Objection. Overruled. The lawyer pressed on. And isn't it also true that you and Mr. Lawson had an altercation just last year? Objection sustained. But the jury had heard it, and more importantly so had Elijah. He knew. Caldwell knew the kind of man he was. If he was on the stand, there was more to this story than what was being said. Then came the next piece of evidence, the gun. Denton lifted a plastic bag containing the weapon recovered near the crime scene. Ballistics confirmed this was the firearm used in the robbery and shooting. And while Mr. Lawson's fingerprints weren't found on it, we did find something else. She nodded to an officer who brought forward a small wrinkled piece of paper evidence, bagged and tagged, a receipt. Mr. Lawson's fingerprints were found on this receipt. Denton explained, from that same liquor store, dated only hours before the robbery. A hushed silence filled the courtroom. Elijah exhaled. That was bad. Not proof, but bad. He glanced at Tarren again, hoping, praying for some sign, some explanation. Finally, Tarren lifted his head, his lips parted slightly like he was about to say something, maybe the truth, maybe a lie. But before he could, the courtroom doors burst open. A new witness had come forward, and everything was about to change. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as the doors swung open. A young woman, no older than 25, hesitated, acted at the entrance. She was out of breath, hands gripping the straps of a worn-out backpack. Your Honor, the defense attorney said quickly, this is Kayla Simmons. She has crucial information about this case. She was there that night. Elijah could feel the tension. Shift Prosecutor Denton looked annoyed, but curious. Miss Simmons, Elijah said, keeping his voice, even approached the stand. Kayla was nervous, but when she sat down and took the oath, her voice was clear. I work at the diner across the street from that liquor store, she said. I was leaving my shift when I saw what happened. Denton crossed her arms. And what exactly did you see? Kayla glanced at Tarren before taking a deep breath. I saw two guys outside the store before the robbery. One of them was Tarren. The other was Jason. Caldwell. A murmur rippled through the jury. Elijah straightened in his chair. Caldwell again. What were they doing? The defense attorney asked. They were arguing. I don't know what about, but I heard Jason say something like you, either in or you, a problem. Then Terrence walked away. He didn't go into that store. Jason. Did the room felt like it was holding its breath? Denton's face tightened. Miss Simmons, are you saying that Mr. Lawson was not the person in the store that night? I'm saying it wasn't him who pulled the trigger. I saw Jason run out of there, stuffing something in his jacket. He threw something in the dumpster down the block. The defense attorney's eyes lit up. And did you tell the police? Kayla swallowed hard. I tried, but no one cared what I had to say. Jason, he's got people, he said. If I opened my mouth, I'd regret it. Elijah looked over at the prosecution's table. Denton was silent, thinking she wasn't the type to push a case if she knew it was flawed. Your Honor, Denton finally said, turning toward Elijah, the state requests a recess to reassess new evidence. Elijah nodded, but his mind was spinning. This entire case had been built on shaky ground. a witness with a history of beef with Terrence, no direct fingerprints on the gun. And now, someone else connected to the crime. Seen, they reconvened the next morning. The prosecution dropped the armed robbery charge due to lack of conclusive evidence, but they pushed forward with an accessory to a crime charge, arguing that Tarren had been involved in some capacity. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood on the charge of accessory to armed robbery. We find the defendant a pause. Not guilty. The room erupted, a mixture of shock relief and frustration. The judge's gavel hit the wood, calling for order. Elijah kept his expression firm, but inside something unraveled. The system had been ready to bury Tarren based on assumptions, shaky evidence, and a known liar's word. If Kayla hadn't spoken up, would anyone have cared? Terrence didn't react at first. He just stared ahead, the weight of years of fighting sitting on his shoulders. Then slowly his lips parted, just enough for a breath of disbelief, freedom. But as the room settled, Elijah knew this wasn't over, because justice wasn't just about this one case. It was about all the others. Like it, the courtroom emptied out slowly. Some left, shaking their heads, others in hushed conversation about what had just happened. But Elijah, he just sat there watching. Tarren, for a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally Tarren turned. "You really didn't say a word the whole time," he muttered. "Not one damn thing." Elijah met his gaze. "Wasn't my place." Tarren let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, that's what I figured. There was something unspoken between them, something neither of them had the words for." Tarren had almost lost his future in that courtroom, not because of what he had done, but because of what people assumed, because of who he used to be, because of a system that had already made up its mind before the trial even started. Elijah had always believed in the law. He built his life on it. But today he had seen the cracks up close. "Where do you go from here?" Elijah finally asked. Tarren exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I don't. No, ain't much left for me out there. No job. No real place to stay." He shrugged. "Guess I just try not to get in the way." Right. Something about those words hit Elijah hard. Try not to get in the way. Like his existence itself was an inconvenience, like he was expected to fail. Again, Elijah reached into his robe pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and scribbled something down. He handed it. "A friend of mine runs a trade program, carpentry, electrical work, and other skills. It doesn't pay much, just enough to keep the lights on." Tarren glanced at the paper, then back at him. "Why are you doing this?" Elijah took a deep breath, thinking about the years, the choices, the roads that led them here. Finally, he spoke. "Because you never really had a chance. Not a real one." Tarren didn't respond right away. He just slipped the paper into his pocket and gave a slow nod. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, it was the first step. As Elijah watched him walk out of the courthouse, stepping into the sunlight like a man who had barely survived the storm, a realization hit him. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt, who is offered a second chance, and who is left behind. Some people have to fight twice as hard just to be seen as worthy of fairness. And for too many, that fight never ends. So before you judge someone because of their past, their mistakes, or even just their appearance, ask yourself, would you feel the same if it were you standing before that judge? One assumption, one overlooked truth, one moment of silence can change a life forever. If this story made you think, don't let it end here. Share it. Keep the conversation alive. Because justice isn't just decided in courtrooms, it's decided by us every single day. And if you believe in stories that matter, hit that subscribe button now.